What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and it is time for Regional Championship Charlotte featuring the Modern format at SCGCon Charlotte. This is the last of two regional championships held in the United States, and yes, this is the first time that this is happening. We finally, instead of having an 1,800 to 2,000 person tournament, we've had smaller bite-sized, probably about 1,000 player tournaments, which still, mind you, are bigger than most regional championships anywhere else in the world, and we are excited to bring more competitive Magic to the internet and hopefully figure something out about the Modern format, because it's been crazy. You know, we've had the Breach decks kind of dominating all over the world. We've had, you know, some new risers to the format, but it just seems the constant is these top three decks. So of course, while we are getting into the event and we're talking about what the players are playing for, who's going to be commentating, who's going to be there, and kind of some of our own expectations and predictions, we of course are going to be talking about the Modern metagame as well, and kind of going into the different decks we're going to be seeing over the course of the weekend and kind of evaluating where they need to be at. And spoilers, there's some really high expectations for a lot of these decks coming into this weekend if they want to find success coming out of the regional championship season and going into the RCQ season, which the next one is going to be Modern, and we're going to be rolling into the standard regional championships, you know, once we get a little bit farther down the road, taking place in the middle of this year. Of course, before we talk about anything to do with Regional Championship Charlotte and knowing the things that you need to know for this event, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, leave a like on the video, all that fun stuff. If you enjoy the content, we're trying to get to 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I can use any and all support that you guys can give me. I am very thankful for all the people that have shown their support. Come on to the videos, comment, all that fun stuff, and I really do appreciate that. And if you want even more content from me, I do stream on Twitch. You can go ahead and follow my Twitch channel down in the description below. I have a podcast called the Casual Spikes Podcast that I host with my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy, and we talk about a lot of the same stuff here. We try to go over a lot of what is going on for the regional championships, for the Pro Tours, World Championships, break down the metagame, and even sometimes going head-to-head with some of the most popular decks of the metagame in Standard and Modern. So if you don't want to miss any of that stuff, be sure to go over there and subscribe to that channel as well, and also show Randy some love too. He's been doing a lot of cool stuff over on his channel, really breaking down a lot of the metagames and stuff for the regional championship season. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly subscription service that you can use to rent cards on Magic the Gathering Online, so you can play in your own leagues and even challenges to qualify for the Pro Tour through the online circuit. I really like using Manatraders. I've had them for over 5 years, essentially from 2 different stints, and they're just a really convenient service. I absolutely love them, using them for, you know, playtesting purposes, because I can just rent and play whatever decks I want. Of course, great for content as well. When I do stream, I can basically play whatever the heck I want for y'all. So definitely go ahead and check them out. Link in the description down below, or excuse me, my code down in the description below for 5% off your monthly subscription should you choose to sign up for Manatraders. I would greatly appreciate it. And now let's get into the meat and potatoes and see what exactly the players are playing for and get some information on how you can watch Regional Championship Charlotte this coming weekend. So here we have kind of the blurb for the main event, the Regional Championship in Charlotte at SCGCon Charlotte. I will have this link in the description down below so you can see all the events going on. There's going to be some last chance qualifiers going on there as well. So if you kind of know someone that's going and you just want to check it out, maybe you have the weekend free, maybe it's worth it to play in some of those last chance qualifiers. You will be playing the Modern format, and I believe you have to go 5-0 in one of those to be able to qualify for the Regional Championship. So it is definitely a way that if you weren't already previously qualified, that you can still qualify for that, which I would expect us to have about 1,000 players for this event as well. We did have, I believe, 1,031 at Regional Championship Portland, so definitely kind of going up there in numbers, because I think even right now there's like 850 to 900 players that have been completely registered for this event. So I would say that between those two regional championships, I think it would be more people than what we had for the largest regional championship in Washington, D.C. So definitely something that's really cool. But enough of that stuff. Players, their deck lists are due March 7th at 6 p.m., so that's the Friday before the event, because the event does take place on March 8th. And this time around with something new, because in Portland, the cards from Aether Drift were not legal. They decided that since it was release weekend, that the only event where these cards were not going to be legal was the Regional Championship. They were legal in all the side events and stuff going on for Modern, Standard, all that kind of stuff. They did not have them legal for the Regional Championship. So this is going to be the first time here in the United States that we are seeing these cards legal in Modern and seeing them played on camera, which is going to be pretty exciting. I know we have some pretty, I'd say, obvious cards. I think Catcher Mouse being the biggest one that I think is going to have the biggest impact on the weekend, just because it seemed to kind of breathe life into some of these new kind of mid-range decks where we've seen, you know, the Orzhov mid-range deck definitely being a pretty big role player in this metagame and kind of getting a boost from Ketramos. We've also seen some of the Esper Frog decks kind of pick this up and play it as like a way that they could draw some extra cards, kind of like we would seen back in the day with people playing like Underworld Breach and Bauble and just playing like value breaches to like draw a bunch of cards, essentially getting to do the same thing with Psychic Frog. But yeah, I mean, that's going to be pretty sweet, honestly, seeing some of these Aether Drift cards. But Saturday, March 8th, 9 a.m. is the players meeting, and we have 9 rounds of Swiss with all players with 18 plus match points advancing to day 2, which is usually a 6-3 record or better. Of course, you have some very wonky and like wacky records that you can have to actually make day 2. I mean, you could be like 5-1-3, I believe. Yeah, that's 9. That adds up to 9. You can be 5-1-3 and make it to day 2. Now, you're probably not making the top 8 with that sort of record unless you win every single round the next day, because essentially kind of having a draw is the same thing as a loss unless you can cobble together 3 of them, which, again, not ideal, but technically you can make day 2 on that sort of record. But you're going to be looking to make it with at least a 6-3 record or better. That's going to kind of keep you in the hunt for top 8. Having this little bit smaller of a tournament of nearly 1,000 players. And then if you are able to have 18 plus match points on day 1, you end up advancing to day 2, where same thing, at 9 a.m., round 10 will begin. You will play 6 rounds of Swiss, and then the top 8 players from that Swiss after day 1 and day 2 will then advance to a single elimination playoff, which, again, is not anything new, and that is also best of 3. Maybe a little bit confusing because we did have the Pro Tour a few weeks ago, and they played a best of 5 in the top 8, and that's only really for the Pro Tour and for the World Championship. At these regional championship levels and even at the Spotlight Series, you're going to see a best of 3. What exactly are the players playing for? Well, they're playing for $20,000 for first place, a World Championship invitation, Pro Tour invitation, Regional Championship invitation. You're basically going to be set up for the next at least probably 3 to 6 months of competitive Magic. You're going to invite to one of the next regional championships coming up. You're going to get an invite to the Pro Tour, which I believe the next one is going to be for Las Vegas, I think is the one that this qualifies for. So that's going to be the next regional championship, which I believe is Final Fantasy. And of course, World Championship invitation taking place towards the end of the year. This is the big thing. I mean, getting basically a Worlds invite where, you know, you're not stressing necessarily at the Pro Tour to kind of make it and then try to make top 8 to then qualify for the World Championship. Nope, just with a win or just showing up to the finals, you are going to get the World Championship invitation, the Pro Tour, and the Regional Championship invitation. Plus $20,000 is really nice in your pocket, along with, you know, $10K to the second place. Top 4, if you end up being a semifinal finisher, you end up being essentially the first loser and the first 2 people to miss out on the World Championship. Technically, I don't make the rules here, but you still get $5,000, Pro Tour invitation, and a regional championship invite. Really not bad overall. I mean, especially for, you know, a weekend's worth of work. Top 8 gets $3,000, Pro Tour invitation, regional championship invitation. Top 16, $2,000, Pro Tour and regional championship invitation. Now, the top 32 is where the cutoff is for the Pro Tour invitation and then the regional championship invite. And the top 128 players are going to qualify for the regional championship next and get $125 cash money in their pocket. So definitely not a bad payout overall for an event like this. Of course, a lot of these players qualifying at last chance qualifiers during the RCQ season. I don't think there's really anybody that gets a special invite necessarily to regional championships. Some players may be deferring from the previous season or, you know, only getting one invite and deciding to come to Charlotte, you know, those sort of things. But that's what's at stake for the players here. They also get a promo card and some pretty sweet badges too. I can't remember exactly what the promos were for the regional championship, but, you know, they were pretty sweet, and maybe I'll remember to flash them up on camera. But, you know, this is a really cool tournament. Unfortunately, I've only gotten to participate in one of them, and, you know, I had an absolute blast. So if you are able to play in a regional championship qualifier, or if you're able to go and kind of enjoy the weekend at SCG Con Charlotte, you know, and play in some of the last chance qualifiers, maybe even qualify for the main event, you know, it is really fun. SCG puts on a great show. I say it every single time, you know, and, you know, this is just no different here. We also have the commentating crew, which I believe it ends up being Corey Baumeister and Jim Davis, and then of course we have Mason Clark and Carmen Handy, or Carmen Claparents, being the commentating cast for this event, which I believe Carmen and Mason were a very good team this last time around at SCG Con Regional Championship Portland at SCG Con Portland. And Corey Baumeister, always enjoy having his kind of energy and presence in the booth and getting to have whatever person that I named, because I, of course, forgot because I have the memory of a goldfish here. But, you know, having Corey and Jim Davis, I believe that's who it is, in the booth for that is going to be awesome, and I do look forward to kind of, the coverage and everything for the weekend, because again, this is going to be some high-level Magic that is featuring a not necessarily entirely new Modern format, but is featuring a Modern format where we've had a little bit of time since the regional championship in Portland. Of course, players and the decks have kind of evolved at this point, where I think that Underworld Breach is still one of the best decks to be playing in the format, but we're going to be kind of going into some of the deck lists that we're going to expect to see here, definitely going with the big three of the format in the Underworld Breach decks, the Boros Energy and the Eldrazi decks, and then looking for some other decks that could potentially be a sleeper pick, if you're trying to figure out what deck is actually going to win on the weekend. So let's go ahead and start off with probably the front runner and the favorite for actually taking down Regional Championship Charlotte. So what we're going to do here, we're going to show off the decks. We're going to kind of talk about them a little bit, maybe if you've been out of the loop for a while, or if you're just new to the Modern format, kind of get an idea of what these decks are trying to accomplish, when they're obviously playing out their turns in the tournament, and also kind of giving a one-line headline of sorts to kind of, see exactly where we're at and give you kind of an idea of what we're looking at this weekend. So the Grinding Station deck is probably one of the best decks in the format currently. This list winning the challenge on March 1st. But essentially, you're trying to get cards like Grinding Station and Underworld Breach onto the battlefield with something like a Mox Opal or a Mox Amber in play. So the combo goes that you have a Grinding Station in play, and then you can sacrifice a Mox Opal after floating mana with it. And with this card, Underworld Breach allowing you to cast on-land cards from your graveyard with Escape, and the escape cost being 3 cards plus paying the card's mana cost, you are able to mill enough cards at Grinding Station to be able to pay that additional cost. A Mox Opal is free, so you can just basically cast it for free, exiling the same 3 cards, floating mana with Mox Opal. So essentially, every time you go through this loop, you're netting a mana, you're going over and over again, and you go until you're able to play the card Thassa's Oracle with an empty library, and you end up winning the game. Now, there's some players that have opted for something like Grape Shot, where you're able to float enough mana and get enough cards in the graveyard, where then you can cast a lethal Grape Shot, and I'm sure there's probably reasons and things like that where players want to go for Grape Shot instead of playing Thassa's Oracle. There's some people that are playing both, some playing one or the other. I think Thassa's Oracle is just kind of a super easy, clean way. I mean, it's you just essentially show your opponent the loop over and over again, you flip 3 card, whatever, until you find Thassa's Oracle, and then you play it and win the game. And there's even some cases where you're going to be able to play it multiple times, your opponent's able to, stop the trigger from going off, which can kind of blow you out if you're not able to actually play the Thassa's Oracle multiple times in a turn. This also means that there are plenty of setups for this deck that can win the game on turn 2. It's just a really fast combo deck that is super resilient to hate, while some of these combo decks end up just kind of losing to one piece of graveyard hate, because you do need the graveyard, obviously, with Underworld Breach to kind of go off and win the game. You can play through some amount of graveyard hate. We even see kind of in the sideboard here, Jace Wielder Mysteries is another way where if you just draw a card from empty library, you win the game instead. We see cards like Flame of Anor, which is a pretty good value cards of getting to destroy artifacts, and then of course getting to get some card advantage and dealing with some high toughness creatures, getting to deal 5 damage. It's pretty sweet. And then the fact that you control a wizard, which Tameo and Emery, both key pieces of the deck, are both wizards, so you actually get full value for the Flame of the North. You see red and 6s and things like that. It's another way that you can kind of play these longer and grind your games. And then again, plenty of other things in here to where you can just kind of deal with what your opponent has going on when they're trying to mess with your graveyard, trying to stop you from casting a bunch of spells, etc. And the big thing we're going to be looking for Grinding Station this weekend is if it can actually close out a tournament. If you watch Regional Championship Portland, I haven't really been paying attention to the other regional championships just with all the stuff kind of going on standard, but if you look at Regional Championship Portland, this deck was tied for the most registered deck with Boros Energy. It was the most played deck in day 2. It put 3 copies in the top 8, the most of any other deck in the format. I believe there was no deck that really had a comparable win rate that was also playing near the amount of copies that people were playing this card. So, had probably the highest win rate, honestly, given the amount of decks that it played. Of course, there's probably technically other decks that had higher win rates, but not anywhere near the amount of copies that were, of people that were playing this deck. And on top of that, too, really the only thing it didn't do was win the tournament that weekend, and ended up losing to Amulet Titan, which had the number one seeded deck going into the top 8 and, beating the number 2 seed who was playing Grinding Breach. So this deck has been absolutely dominant all season. I mean, at the start, we kind of talked about, can anything knock off Boros Energy? Is it just too consistent? Does it have enough tools to kind of fight against all the unfair stuff going on in the metagame? And it turns out it does get access to some really good tools, but it's not the best deck in the format anymore. Certainly, it's the most consistent. We've seen some really good players like playing Boros Energy that are able to kind of beat the Grinding Station decks, but on average, I think the average Grinding Station player deck is just better than the average Boros Energy player, meaning that, Grinding Station is just absolutely, going to dominate the tournament. I kind of expect this to be the most registered deck in the tournament, and we're going to see if it can finally convert and turn it into a win. It won the European Regional Championship. It's performed very well across the board at regional championships, and across the, lower levels of Modern into the upper levels as well. I mean, this is just the deck that a lot of players are gravitating towards, and a deck that if you just have this laying around, or, you have like the ability to play this deck, absolutely play it. Is absolutely insane. It's one of the best decks in the format for a reason, and if you're able to kind of go through the loops and be able to understand, how not to get blown out or to like minimize the impact of sideboard cards against you while also maximizing your potential, this deck is just going to absolutely run through all of the competition and stuff. So that's definitely something to keep in mind this weekend, is if Grinding Station can kind of hold its own, I mean, not even really hold its own, that's really a bad word to use, can really just kind of prove that it is the de facto best deck in the format, because more than likely it's not long for this world. We might see Underworld Breach banned at the end of March, kind of going into that regional championship qualifier season. So we'll kind of see how that goes, but until this point, Grinding Station, to me, is the odds-on favorite and probably my pick to win the whole tournament. But like I said, there is a big three of this format, and while they might not be, on the surface nearly as good or as explosive as what this Grinding Station deck can be, they are fairly consistent players and do have some nice options of actually fighting against Grinding Station. So let's look at a deck that I've previously called the best deck in the format that's kind of taking a little bit of a fall off here as of late. So the next deck we're going to take a look at here real quick is the Boros Energy deck. This has the best 1-2 punch and Guided Souls, Ocelot Pride, both at 4 copies. These both kind of get to feed off of each other. They're 2 cards that you never really care if you draw a lot of one and not a lot of the other one, like a lot of 2-card combos where you want to draw a lot of one piece and not so much of another. This is one where you're fine with drawing 3 Ocelot Prides and 1 Guided Souls, or 3 Guided Souls and 1 Ocelot Pride. Obviously, I think Ocelot Pride in more copies is a lot better than Guided Souls, but you still get to kind of go pretty crazy and just put immense amount of pressure on your opponent. So essentially, Ocelot Pride, every time you gain life at the beginning of your end step, then you create a 1/1 cat, and if you have the City's Blessing, which is basically if you control 10 or more permanents, then you make a token copy of each token that enters the battlefield this turn. So with Ocelot Pride and Guided Souls, obviously with the City's Blessing, you're going to make a ton of tokens, meaning you're going to gain a ton of life and get a bunch of energy with Guided Souls, meaning that then with multiple Guided Souls, when you attack, you're going to get multiple triggers of getting to be able to pay 3 energy, and putting 2+1/+1 counters and a flying counter on a target attacking creature. It becomes an angel, whatever. This is going to put an immense amount of pressure on your opponent because you're going to be able to make a ton of flyers. They're all going to be 3-4 power creatures that are just going to be able to deal tons of damage to your opponent and really kind of set them back and force them to play in a very specific way where they're either going to have to interact with the board in a huge way, which means that they're probably not going for their combo or really getting to do effectively what they want to do, or they're going to have to try to hurry up and combo through it, and a lot of times that forces combo players to go for it when they don't necessarily have it, and ends up putting them in a lot worse position to where now it's almost impossible for them to win, versus if they were able to maybe hold off for a turn, they could have had a lot higher of a percentage of actually winning. On top of that too, Ragavan, former best card in Modern, also here at 3 copies. Ajani Nakatl Pariah, fighting for one of the best flip planeswalkers in the format, with the Tameo. This is going to help you deal tons and tons of damage by being able to make cat tokens and then doming your opponent if you control another red permanent. And of course, Goblin Bombardment here as well, able to flip the Ajani while also you're making a ton of tokens onto the board. You're able to throw them at your opponent after hitting them for a bunch of damage. This is like a way that you can close out games really quickly. Static Prison is like a nice catch-all removal spell. Thraben Charm, getting to exile the graveyard, destroy enchantments, and of course be creature removal when you need it, because it's going to deal twice the amount of damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creatures, so you're going to be able to take out some really big creatures by just having a few on the board. March of the Otherworldly Light, Not only is a tongue twister, but it's like an instant speed way that even if you don't have a lot of mana, this allows you to kind of remain efficient while then also exiling white cards from your hand. Really only need to exile one because a lot of the time you're going to be wanting to hit Grinding Station or Underworld Breach with this card. So then you're able to do that and not really worry about it. You can also kind of tag a Mox Opal as well if your opponent's not really prepared for it because you just end up paying a white and getting it out of there. Galvanic Discharge as well, also being an insane card. And with cards like Seasoned Pyromancer, again, like a Giant Cuddle Pariah, both getting to make tokens. If you have Ocelot Prides going, you're going to be able to make a ton of these tokens here that are also going to trigger Guide of Souls a bunch of times and potentially put just lethal into play. Also, again, some really good cyber cards. More Marches, Orum's Chance pretty good, Stony Silence, Wrath of Skies, things like that. Molten Rain being a really nice one because you can just blow up non-basic lands and kind of burn your opponent, as well as just getting to destroy lands and kind of screw with their mana base a little bit here. Notably, no Blood Moons in this deck. This has kind of been shying away from playing Blood Moons and going more into like these Molten Rain / Stone Rain style of cards. And the sideboard, we even see that in the Eldrazi deck, which we're going to look at next, is playing Stone Rain. And, for Boros Energy, my kind of thought process, the kind of the headline for this deck is, can it return to form? Again, this has been a deck that I thought for a lot of these regional championships was going to be the most registered deck. It had been the most registered deck in a lot of the modern events that we had seen here recently, and again, it's probably one of the most consistent decks in the format. I mean, while some other decks, they might mulligan to like 6 or 5 and, have to keep kind of clunky hands, this deck doesn't really have very clunky hands unless you're drawing like 2 lands and like a bunch of 3s and, 2s and 3s that you don't necessarily want to play. This deck is really, if you have a Guide of Souls Ocelot Pride, you almost don't care what the rest of your hand is made up of. Even if you just have 1 land in it, you really don't care what those other 4 cards are. You have the 3 best cards in your deck, a way to cast both of your busted 1-drops. So for Boros Energy, it's going to be, can this be a return to form? Can we find somebody who has a pretty good list and players that are pretty in tune with the format here to kind of figure out, okay, what can we do to kind of give ourselves a better percentage against the most played deck, or what we perceive is going to be the most played deck in the format in the Grinding Station deck. So it's definitely going to be up to Boros Energy here. I do think that the Eldrazi deck does have a lot of good tools as well that it gets to play in the main deck. I don't think Boros Energy really gets to play a lot of those because you want to have like a critical mass of cards that are just going to help you, flood the board with a ton of creatures and try to close it out with Goblin Bombardment, and that's what we're going to be seeing, and that's kind of the game plan. I think a lot of these Boros Energy decks are going to have is just trying to be as aggressive as possible early on. Hope that the Grinding Breach decks don't have their kind of nut draw where they went on turn 2 or turn 3 and Boros Energy is getting beyond the play and try to steal a sideboarded game from the Grinding Breach deck while also trying to win game 1, being super important here. But aside from the Breach deck, I think Boros Energy has a lot of game against everything. I think it's a little bit worse against the current versions of the Eldrazi deck that we are seeing, just because they have, mass removal that kind of then also is able to be played again by playing big things. So I think that matchup is a little awkward for Boros Energy, but overall, I am a pretty big fan of this Boros Energy deck. Again, I think just being the most consistent deck definitely helps it out a lot when you're playing against some of these other wonky matchups that aren't necessarily the other top 2 decks in the format, because even though we do have kind of a 3-deck format with like some others kind of, on the outside looking in, there's a lot of other players that are registering other decks for this event, and I think that this has a pretty decent matchup. It's definitely not, I think, as awful. You can definitely win with some tight play in some of those matchups, and I think you're just going to be better overall against the rest of the field. But, of course, we're going to check out the last deck that I thought going into the season would have been one of the best counters to the Breach deck, but it's just kind of been lackluster ever since the European Regional Championship, even having a decent showing in the Regional Championship in Portland, but not really getting to, make as big of a splash as I thought it was going to end up making here. So let's go ahead and check out this Eldrazi ramp deck. So here we have the last of our big 3 decks, and this is Eldrazi Ramp deck. So Eldrazi Ramp is trying to abuse the card Ugin's Labyrinth. This is a land that, when it comes into play, you can imprint a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand. It'll tap for a colorless mana, and if a card is exiled with Ugin's Labyrinth, it adds 2 colorless instead. And kind of the surprising thing about this that we see is that this is 2 colorless mana that doesn't have any sort of restriction on it. So unlike cards like Eldrazi Temple, where you can tap it for 2 colorless, but you have to cast Eldrazi spells and activate the ability of colorless Eldrazi, Ugin's Labyrinth allows you to cast basically whatever you want. which means that you can go, turn one, Ugin's Labyrinth, imprinting a card into something like a Talisman of Impulse, and then play another land, and then you have access to 4 unrestricted mana right away, which goes into casting Summoning Mycospawns. This allows you to ramp, find any one of your kind of utility lands, Bojuka Bog, when you exile your opponent's graveyard. You can go ahead and find like Sanctum of Ugin if you have a really big Eldrazi spell that you want to cast next turn. It's especially good if you have like Eldrazi Temple after playing something like a Talisman of Impulse and a Ugin's Labyrinth, because that's going to be 5, 6 mana, and then with a 7th mana you can cast like Devourer of Destiny from your hand to be able to crack the Sanctum to go and get something else. Even casting a World Breaker is going to kind of do the same thing and allow you to kind of keep this engine going, keep the gas flowing with a Sanctum of Ugin, or even getting to get Ghost Quarter and kind of disrupt your opponent's mana base, or more Eldrazi Temples to cast some of these Eldrazi spells here. You're really kind of building up to playing Emrakul, the Promised End. This is a way that, for the other 2 decks in the format here, I mean, we've talked about kind of the Goblin Bombardment being a card that the Boros Energy deck can use to kind of close out games fairly quickly by having a pretty aggressive start. This is also a way that you can essentially wrath your opponent's board, or even in some cases they build out a big enough board and they aren't able to actually play their Goblin Bombardment, then you just play their own Goblin Bombardment and then you throw all the creatures at their own face and then win the game that way. Or if you're playing against the the breach decks, you're able to go through the full combo with them and mill their whole deck and then just kind of exile their win conditions, so that even if they somehow have a way, which, I mean, you're going to control their turn, you're going to be able to play like all their things anyway, that you're going to be able to get rid of anything that they could possibly do, and they're going to draw a card from an empty library and lose the game. This card is absolutely bonkers in this format, even in those cases where you're not getting to, take your opponent's turn and then kill them with one of their own things. You are going to be able to set them back pretty far to where it's going to be a pretty tall ask for those decks to kind of deal with the 13/13. And really, aside from like the Boros Energy decks having things like Static Prison to deal with Emrakul, they don't really have a lot of good options. It's going to be trying to bounce the Emrakul, which then they get to play it again, and then whatever damage that they weren't able to do, they weren't necessarily able to cause max damage, them getting to take 2 of your turns and basically do whatever the heck they want, a lot of the time is going to be enough to kind of close out games. Karn the Great Creator, I think, is a card that is absolutely amazing here, where you get to shut off the activated abilities of artifacts that your opponent controlled and they can't be activated. You're going to be able to turn on those things and be able to, blow them up with some of your other creature removal, somewhere in here. But a lot of the time you're going to be able to kind of turn on some of your own things to kind of help you close out games a little bit quicker. And then also going to go into your sideboard and have this, what we call a Karn board, having explosives, Tormod's Crypt, for the graveyard decks, liquid metal coating, so you can start blowing up their lands, Soulless Jailer, Stonebrain, Ensnaring Bridges, Cityscape Levelers as well, these sort of things. Interesting with this deck that I really liked from the other versions is that they would play main deck Kozilek's Return, and this is not playing them in the main, it's actually playing them in the sideboard, which they cannot get with the Karn the Great Creator because it says specifically Artifact and not colorless card. So unfortunately, these are kind of stuck in the main board, but I don't think you necessarily need them for the Boros matchup. It definitely is kind of nice to have, but you do have All Is Dust here as maybe a little bit more versatile of a removal spell than something like Kozilek's Return, which is going to be specifically for the Boros Energy matchups. You even see here, sideboard, Stone Rain just to destroy lands. Like, this is going to be an easy way for you to kind of ramp with sowing Mycospawns and kind of getting ahead while also getting a Stone Rain in your opponent. It's going to be pretty good in the mirror matches. Lastly, like, Kozilek's Command is a pretty insane card. This is like a way that you're going to be able to look at a bunch of cards to go find an Emrakul, the Promised End, and then make a ton of tokens as well, so that you can actually cast Emrakul and have plenty of mana left over to kind of fill out your board. Again, further decimating your opponent's position and making it a lot easier for you to kind of win on the crackback when you actually get your turn after them taking an extra turn. And for Eldrazi Ramp, it's going to be kind of the same thing as, what we talked about with the Boros Energy deck. Like, can this deck kind of prove that it can take on the Breach deck and it can actually kind of take the reins of the format? Now, this deck did put 2 copies in the top 8 of the regional championship in Portland, so it's definitely no slouch. It is the only other deck in that tournament that put multiple copies into the top 8. Unfortunately, had to play each other in the quarterfinals and then just got absolutely dumpstered in the semifinals. And against a matchup where I think it wants to play against the Breach decks. Now, this does not, I would say that Breach maybe is a little bit more consistent potentially at, trying to put its combo into play and get to 4 mana and do its thing, versus the Eldrazi ramp deck where, even if you get to 4 mana, you have to have like the Karn, you have to have Ugin's Labyrinth, and then you also have to follow it up with a Talisman or be able to kind of do a bunch of things here. Even like the turns where you can go, say, like Utopia Sprawl on a land and then play a Ugin's Labyrinth also kind of works out the same way to play Karn the Great Creator because of shutting off the artifacts here. But, it's definitely up to players to kind of find a consistent build for this Eldrazi ramp deck to try to do its thing as fast as possible. It does have these really busted starts. Unfortunately, is a little slow if it is on the draw against those decks because, again, you just have the potential to combo out from underneath your opponent. You really don't have a lot of good interaction here. Even if you kind of go turn 2, they combo on turn 2 and you're on the draw, like even having, playing a Eldrazi Temple to be able to cast a Kozilek's command is not going to do anything because you're not going to be able to exile anything from your opponent's graveyard to try to disrupt them. But there's a lot of good tools here. There's a lot of good stuff in the sideboard. I think if you can get a Karn the Great Creator down, it's not necessarily lights out, but when you're tutoring up a hate piece every single turn for the most part and just putting your opponent further and further behind and forcing them to have a bunch of answers that aren't typically going to be in their main deck, this deck does have a lot of the things going for it where I could see it being, again, a pretty good and a pretty solid kind of choice for a lot of these players going into this tournament. I think it's probably going to be somewhere in the top 5. I might even be still the 3rd most registered deck for this event. I think going into this event is going to be very strong. It's just going to be hoping to find the right build where I think everybody's trying to catch up to the Breach decks more so than, everybody else trying to catch up to like the big 3. And so I think Eldrazi Ramp definitely has a lot of great things going for it, just like the Boros Energy deck does. It's just going to be how much main deck hate do you want to play for the Breach decks, and how many percentage points are you willing to lose kind of against the rest of the field and trying to do it. And I think Eldrazi Ramp has the lowest opportunity cost, or like the lowest, negative cost, I would say, for doing something like that, just for the fact that he gets to play 4 Karn, and the fact that Karn is a 4-drop, meaning that he can just play it on turn 2 with, basically no kind of hassle to it, and go get like a Tormod's Crypt and have a pretty big piece of hate on the board where it's like, okay, well now I'm going to get to nuke your graveyard whenever I feel like it, and you're also going to have to get Karn off the board if you want to be able to kind of mill yourself and things like that. So definitely something to kind of keep an eye out for this Eldrazi deck. I expect it to have a pretty good weekend overall. Just like all the big 3, I expect them to all perform pretty well this weekend. And but I think that overall the the Breach deck is probably going to have the best weekend of the 3 just because it's continued to kind of dominate the format up to this point. Now let's go ahead and look at some weird kind of off-the-wall decks that we could expect to see. I don't even think they're necessarily weird. That's probably a bad thing to say, but some decks that are kind of on the outside looking in that I think are pretty good anti-metagame picks and have the potential to kind of, again, do some damage into the format and kind of break out and show that they're not just kind of gimmicky sort of decks, that they're actually pretty big players in this metagame. So those are the main decks of the modern metagame. So what other decks could players potentially bring? And I think that there's only a few really good options kind of going forward. I think that Amulet Titan, being the deck that won the regional championship Portland and was actually number 1 overall seed in that tournament, is another solid option. Again, I think that's a deck that, I've said it in many videos, if you are just going to pick up a deck and play it, Amulet Titan is certainly not that deck. I think even if you gave me a few weeks of playing multiple leagues a day, every day, and reading the, Amulet Titan manifesto, I think maybe I could pilot it semi-competently and maybe not look like a total jackass, but at the same time, like, it's a deck that is incredibly impossible. There's so many different scenarios that, like, you could probably play 100 games and never run into that scenario at all. And of course, until the very important moment where maybe you're playing for like day 2 of the event or something like that, and it's like, oh, well, I have no idea how to navigate this. And it's just kind of a jarring and shocking deck, I think, for a lot of people just to pick up and play. I think you need to really put a lot of time and effort into it. It's definitely a deck that will pay you off for the knowledge, because it always seems to be at least a tier 1.5 to like a tier 2 deck at the very worst in a lot of metagames. And even a deck where, grinding, Underworld Breach decks are, probably the best decks to be playing in the format currently. Of course, we talk about again and again how Temur Breach absolutely dominated these regional championships here. But I think that long-term, maybe kind of shift towards Titan, like after this event, maybe even in a post-ban world. But I definitely expect a lot of very good Amulet Titan players to show up and hopefully, have a pretty good showing with the deck and, continue to show people that, like, hey, even though it's never been like necessarily the most broken thing ever happening in the format, people still get to play this deck because it just gets to dodge every single banning. And lastly, I think another really good option is black-white mid-range, and it's especially tempting because of Ketramos being legal in this format. Now, we know that at Regional Championship Portland, they actually banned quote-unquote Aether Drift cards just for the fact that the product was releasing that weekend, and players weren't going to really have like an ample amount of time to actually acquire the cards and put them in their deck. That was kind of an unprecedented thing in of itself, and now that we have Ketramos legal for the format, and of course black-white has also kind of undergone some changes itself, which we have done a deck tech on kind of some of the new variants of black-white. It seems like they're kind of sticking more towards the using Ketramos as like card advantage, and you kind of get to hate out the graveyard, and of course it ends up being a very good attacker that is going to swing a lot of games in your favor for the fact that this is just a really big creature that is going to gain you some life. It's going to require multiple blocks from your opponent to be able to do anything about it, and of course they're really not going to be able to get rid of it, and it's just going to be a source of card advantage through a lot of the game that eventually when you can attack with it, it's just going to kind of gain you that life back, kind of what we see from like the Necro Dominance decks where they end up gaining a ton of life and then they draw a bunch of cards to gas back up, and then they ditch a bunch of the cards that they were going to end up discarding anyway to get some value, gain some more life, so then the next turn they can draw more cards, and the cycle just kind of keeps going. Just black-white has been kind of a pretty established deck currently in the metagame for about the last like 2 months. Has definitely proven its worth, and I think it only really gets better from here on out now that, of course, Ketramos is legal, and we're going to have some more ways of, out card advantaging our opponents and trying to grind out a lot of those long games that we end up wanting to play as that deck. Past that, I mean, we're definitely going to see a pretty wide metagame. It seems like Dimir Mill is kind of picking up a lot of steam here. The Yawgmoth players are going to come out. The other creature decks, like Samwise combo, performed very well at the last regional championship. I kind of expect that to show up as well. Maybe not in nearly as high numbers as Yawgmoth, because that just seems to be the go-to creature deck, but, Samwise is another deck that I kind of expect to, come into that top spot. And, of course, we have all the different variants that people are going to play to try to hate out, the mirror match and have an edge in those matchups, while maybe sacrificing a few percentage points here and there against the rest of the field in general. I mean, we've seen like Jeskai Energy was kind of like a big thing. We're even seeing like Blue-White Miracles kind of show up and post some 5-0s in some different leagues. Players doing very well with those kinds of strategies. Of course, we have Frogtide, whether it's the blue-black versions, whether we're going to see Esper builds or whatever the case may be. We're definitely going to see those players come out and represent their deck. So we're going to be in for a pretty wide and varied metagame. Of course, we're going to be really focused on like the 5 or 6 top decks in the format, which are going to be, the Eldrazi Ramp, the Boros Energy, the Grinding Stations, the black-white mid-range, the Amulet Titan decks, and then maybe a Mystery 6 deck. Maybe we're still looking at like Murktide being, in the top 6 most registered decks, but really we're going to see the bulk of the decks, I believe, in the, the Breach / Energy / Eldrazi, maybe even Titan, because Titan was even a pretty surprising number for me coming in that tournament. So, some predictions for me, I honestly, truly, I think that Breach is going to win this event. I think it's just proven it's been like one of the best decks. I think the players that were playing it, before the Mox Opal unbanning just really got paid off, because now instead of having these complicated loops to figure out what's going on and how you can win, you now have a little bit more of a streamlined way of doing it. Again, it's a deck that I've lauded as the best deck in the format. It's not long for this world. If you have the ability to play it and you have the ability to practice with it, play with it, practice with it, win whatever tournaments you can with it, because it is not going to be legal for too much longer. It's a deck that plays very well against graveyard hate and against other various amounts of hate. It just has a ton of options to kind of do its thing. I think that we will see kind of Eldrazi Ramp also up there towards the top tables. Multiple decks in the top 8. I have a hard time believing that in a month's time it's not going to be a deck that is going to put any copies in the top 8. So I'm expecting really probably only 2 decks to put multiple decks in the top 8. I think we're going to see Grinding Breach probably put somewhere between like 2 to 4, I would say. I think it's kind of poised to, break out even further. I mean, it's already completely broken out, but I just expect it to kind of dominate this tournament. Obviously, it's the decks, it's the players that are playing them, but there's World Championship slots on the line. There's, of course, Pro Tour invites on the line, a lot of cash money, and a great event hosted by a great, company that honestly puts on a really good show. So I expect the Grinding Station decks to definitely show out. I expect them to win the event. I think that Grinding Station is going to be the most registered deck. We might actually see Eldrazi Ramp overtake Boros Energy as the most registered deck. I think Boros Energy is going to kind of fall down the list here, and probably somewhere in like 3rd or 4th, we could even see like Black-White take over for it. I just think that Eldrazi Ramp has a lot, a pretty decent matchup against both Breach and Boros Energy. I kind of expect players to kind of gravitate towards this style of deck more so than the Boros Energy deck. That said, Boros Energy is still going to be a really good deck to play. It's something that I've always touted as a deck that is incredibly consistent at what it does and does have the option to, or really the ability to have some very explosive draws and can just kind of close games out of nowhere thanks to the help of like Goblin Bombardment and Ajani Nakatl Pariah, just being able to flip, deal tons of damage to your opponent equal to the amount of creatures, making more creatures, making cats bigger, having the 1-2 punch of Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride. We can go on and on about this deck. And for me, early is going to be an early front runner when we have bannings happen in the modern format, because again, Breach is likely not for this world. So to kind of nicely wrap things up as I ramble on for another like 5 minutes, I'm sure, I think Breach is going to win the tournament. I think it's going to have the most copies in the top 8. It's going to have another amazing conversion rate. I think it's finally going to get, all the accolades that it should have gotten from the previous tournament, which really all it needs to add is actually winning the whole thing. I don't think we're going to see Boros Energy perform very well this time around. I mean, it did kind of drop in percentage a little bit from day 1 to day 2 in Portland, but I think it's going to take a little bit of a steeper drop off there. I think there's going to be less decks played in day 1, and meaning that there's going to be a worse percentage of those players making day 2. I think players are just firmly ready for that sort of strategy. I think that Eldrazi Ramp could theoretically undercut both decks and end up actually winning the event, even if it doesn't, if it only puts like 1 or 2 players into the top 8 compared to like the 3 or 4 I kind of expect from the Breach decks in the format. And Black-White also, I think, could be an underdog pick here. I could definitely see a path where Black-White ends up actually winning over something like Grinding Station. I really like the white and black cards currently in Modern for their sideboard capabilities, and the Black-White deck, I mean, it's hard not to root for a mid-range deck when at my soul I am a mid-range player. I want games to, basically come down to who uses their resources the best, who gets the most value out of their cards, and eventually you just end up fighting and slapping each other with sticks. That's just the type of Magic that I personally enjoy. So hopefully Black-White has a pretty good showing. We're going to hope that Murktide doesn't necessarily fall off a cliff. We're ultimately probably going to see Grinding Breach end up winning the whole event. But, that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below your predictions for Regional Championship Charlotte. I am excited to see kind of what people come out with. I'm sorry this video is coming out, pretty close to the event. I usually try to get these out on Monday, but just a lot of stuff going on. So I appreciate everyone's patience here. But yeah, hopefully if you enjoyed the video, you want to see more, so you end up subscribing. Of course, leave a like on the video to kind of, help with the engagement and everything like that. Of course, leave a comment down below. Follow all the socials and the links down in the description below. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I hope to see you all in the next one.